Some mothers would tell you that forgiveness is divine, that family comes first no matter what, that children are always worth a second chance. I used to believe that too. My name is Maria Rodriguez, and I'm 74 years old. I've spent most of my life putting my son before myself, making excuses for his behavior, and believing that unconditional love meant accepting unacceptable treatment. But there comes a moment in every woman's life when she realizes that love, without respect, is just manipulation wearing a prettier mask. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months ago, I sat in a sterile dialysis center for 8 hours. 8 full hours. Hooked up to a machine that was keeping me alive, watching every other patient get picked up by their families while I waited for my son who never came. That day, something inside me died and something else was born. That something else had boundaries, had self-worth, and had finally learned that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who claim to love us. This isn't a story about forgiveness. This isn't a story about family reconciliation. This is a story about what happens when a mother finally says, "Enough is enough," and if you think you know how this ends, think again. Because what I discovered about my son that day will shock you as much as it shocked me. My Tuesday mornings always started the same way. 5:30 in the morning, I'd take my medications with a small glass of water, careful not to drink too much because I knew what lay ahead. By 6:15, I'd have my small bag packed with my rosary, a book I probably wouldn't read, and a sweater because dialysis centers are always freezing. By 7, I'd be sitting by my front window, watching for Eduardo's old blue Honda to pull into my driveway. Eduardo is my son. 38 years old, never married, living in the apartment I still pay half the rent for because he says he's between jobs. He's been between jobs since his father died 6 years ago, but I've learned not to mention that anymore. It only starts arguments, and I need him. At my age, with kidney failure, I need someone to drive me to my treatments 3 times a week, someone to make sure I get there safely and get home safely, someone who cares enough to show up. That Tuesday morning in March started like all the others. Eduardo pulled up at 7 sharp, which was unusual because he's normally 10 or 15 minutes late. He seemed different somehow, more alert, almost energetic. He was dressed nicer than usual too, wearing a button-down shirt I'd bought him for Christmas 2 years ago that still had the tags on it when I found it in his closet last month. "Morning, Mommy," he said as I settled into the passenger seat. He always called me Mommy when he wanted something or when he was feeling guilty about something. At 74, you learn to read these signs like weather patterns. "You look nice." "Today, mijo," I told him, adjusting my seatbelt. "What's the occasion?" "Can't a man dress nice to take his mother to her appointment?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Besides, I have some errands to run today. Might as well look professional." Errands. That word always made me nervous when it came from Eduardo's mouth. His errands usually involved asking someone for money or making promises he couldn't keep. But I didn't say anything. I'd learned that questioning Eduardo too much only made him angry, and I couldn't afford to have him angry with me. Not when I needed him. The drive to Valley Dialysis Center took 23 minutes through morning traffic. I know because I count every minute these days. When you're dependent on someone else for transportation to treatments that keep you alive, you become very aware of time. 23 minutes there, 4 hours of treatment, 23 minutes back. That was our routine. 3 times a week for the past 2 years since my kidneys finally gave up their fight. Eduardo walked me inside like he always did, helped me sign in, and kissed my forehead before the nurses took me back to my chair. That kiss felt different too. More formal, like something you do out of obligation rather than love. But maybe I was reading too much into things. Maybe I was just nervous because something in his demeanor was off. "I'll be back at 11:30, Mommy," he said loudly enough for the nurses to hear. 4 hours, just like always. Nancy, my regular nurse, smiled at him. "Such a good son," she said after he left. "You're lucky to have him." Lucky. I used to think so, too. My dialysis chair was number 7, third row from the window. I'd been sitting in the same chair for 2 years, watching the same parking lot, seeing the same rotation of cars coming and going. Dialysis is a strange kind of meditation. You're connected to a machine that's cleaning your blood, keeping you alive, and all you can do is sit there and think. Or try not to think, depending on the day. The first hour passed like it always did. The machine hummed its familiar rhythm, my blood flowing out red and returning cleaner. I tried to read the romance novel my neighbor had lent me, but I kept reading the same paragraph over and over. My mind was elsewhere, stuck on Eduardo's strange mood, his nice clothes, his talk about errands. By the second hour, I started watching the parking lot more intently. Not because I expected Eduardo back early, but because I'd developed a habit of noting who came and went. Mrs. Chen's daughter always arrived at 9:30 to pick up her mother. The tall man in the red truck came for his wife at 10:15. The young woman with the crying baby usually showed up around 10:45 to collect her father. During my third hour, Mrs. Patterson, who sat 2 chairs down from me, started telling Nancy about her grandson's graduation. "He's the first in our family to finish college," she said, her voice full of pride. "My daughter says he wants to be a teacher. Imagine that, my grandson a teacher." I smiled and nodded, but her words stung a little. Eduardo had dropped out of college 3 times. Each time I'd paid the tuition up front because he said financial aid was too complicated. Each time he'd promised this would be different. Each time he'd find reasons to quit before the semester ended. The last time he said college was a scam and he was better off learning real-world skills. That was 8 years ago. I'm still waiting to see what real-world skills he learned. As my 4th hour began, I noticed Nancy checking the clock more frequently. She kept glancing at me, then at the clock, then back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or pity. I didn't like either option. "Everything okay, Nancy?" I asked. "Of course, Mrs. Rodriguez. How are you feeling? Any cramping? Nausea?" "I feel fine." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Why? Just checking. You know how we worry about our favorite patients. But I knew it was more than that. Nancy had been a dialysis nurse for 15 years. She'd told me once that she could tell time by watching families pick up their loved ones. Everyone had a pattern, a routine, a reliability that she'd come to depend on for managing her schedule. When someone broke that pattern, she noticed. Mrs. Chen's daughter arrived at 9:32, 2 minutes later than usual. She apologized profusely to her mother, explaining that traffic had been heavier than expected. Mrs. Chen just smiled and patted her daughter's hand. 2 minutes is nothing, dear. I've been waiting 78 years to see you grown up. What's 2 more minutes? The tall man in the red truck was early today, arriving at 10:05 instead of 10:15. His wife was surprised and delighted. "Look at you being punctual," she teased as he helped her from the chair. "What's gotten into you?" "Figured we could grab breakfast before the lunch crowd hits," he said. "That little cafe you like." They left arm in arm, and I felt a familiar ache in my chest. When was the last time Eduardo had suggested we do something together after my treatment? When was the last time he'd been early for anything involving me? By 10:30, I started checking the clock myself. Eduardo usually arrived at 11:20, 10 minutes before my treatment ended so he could chat with the nurses or use the restroom while they finished my session. But today felt different. Today I found myself hoping he'd be early, hoping he'd surprise me like the man in the red truck had surprised his wife. The young woman with the crying baby arrived at 10:53. Her father was ready and waiting, standing by his chair before she even entered the building. "There's my beautiful granddaughter," he said, taking the baby from his daughters. Arms. Did you miss Grandpa? Of course you did. I watched them leave, 3 generations together, and tried to remember the last time Eduardo had brought anyone to meet me. He'd had girlfriends over the years, but none that he'd introduced to his mother. It's complicated, Mommy, he'd say whenever I asked. When it's serious, you'll be the first to know. I was the last to know about everything in Eduardo's life. His job losses, his money problems, his late-night phone calls that he took in another room. I was the last to know, but somehow I was always the first person he called when he needed something. 11 o'clock came and went, then 11:15. By 11:20, Nancy was definitely watching me more closely. She kept finding reasons. To check my machine, to adjust my blanket, to ask if I needed anything. He's probably just stuck in traffic, I said, more to convince myself than to explain anything to Nancy. I'm sure that's it, she agreed. But her voice had that careful, professional tone that nurses use when they're trying not to worry their patients. 11:30 arrived with no sign of Eduardo's blue Honda in the parking lot. My treatment was scheduled to end at 11:35, but sometimes it ran a few minutes over if my fluid removal wasn't progressing as quickly as expected. Today, it was progressing normally. Today, I would be done right on time with no extra minutes to buffer. Eduardo's lateness. At 11:32, my machine began its final cycle. Nancy started preparing to disconnect me, gathering supplies and sanitizing the area around my access port. She moved slower than usual, buying time, hoping Eduardo would appear before she had to face the awkward conversation about what happens when a patient has no ride home. Mrs. Rodriguez, she said gently, do you have another phone number I could try for Eduardo? Maybe his work? I gave her his cell phone number, the same one he'd had for years, the only number I had for him. She stepped away from my chair to make the call, but I could still hear her side of the conversation. Hi, this is Nancy from Valley Dialysis Center. I'm calling about Maria Rodriguez. Yes, your mother. Well, her treatment is finished, and she's ready to be picked up. I see. Okay. How long do you think? I understand. Could you give me a better estimate? She hung up and returned to my chair with an expression that tried to be reassuring but failed. He's running late, she said. He asked if you could wait about an hour. He got caught up with something important. An hour. Something important. More important than his mother sitting in a dialysis center after 4 hours of treatment, ready to go home. More important than the routine we'd established, the reliability I'd counted on, the basic respect of showing up when you say you will. Did he say what was keeping him? I asked. Nancy hesitated. He just said it was important and he'd explain when he got here. But I could tell from her expression that Eduardo hadn't offered to explain anything. He'd probably been short with her, maybe even rude. Eduardo didn't like to be questioned by people he considered beneath him, and in his mind, that included most people who worked in service jobs. I'd seen him be dismissive to waitresses, impatient with store clerks, condescending to anyone who couldn't do something for him. It embarrassed me, but I'd never said anything. I should have said something. Nancy finished disconnecting me from the machine and helped me to the recovery area, a small section with comfortable chairs where patients could sit for a few minutes before leaving. Usually, family members waited there while the medical staff finished up. Today, I sat alone. Can I get you anything? Nancy asked. Water? A snack? I'm fine, thank you. But I wasn't fine. I was tired from 4 hours of treatment. I was confused about why Eduardo was late. And I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time when it came to my son. Anger. Not the quick flash of irritation when he left dishes in the sink or forgot to call when he said he would. This was deeper, colder. This was the anger that comes from realizing that someone's carelessness is actually cruelty, that someone's thoughtlessness is actually selfishness, that someone's lateness is actually a statement about how little they value your time, your comfort, your needs. 12:30 came and went. Nancy kept checking on me, offering snacks, magazines, anything to make my wait more comfortable. Other patients finished their treatments and left with their families. New patients arrived for the afternoon shift. The center's rhythm continued around me while I sat in the same chair, watching the same parking lot, waiting for the same blue Honda that should have been there an hour ago. At 1 o'clock, Dr. Martinez came to check on me. Dr. Martinez was the center's director, a kind man in his 50s who made it his business to know every patient personally. He sat in the chair next to mine and spoke quietly. "Maria, Nancy tells me you're having transportation issues today. My son is running late. He'll be here soon. How late is he now?" I looked at the clock on the wall. "About an hour and a half." Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "That's a long time to wait after treatment. Are you feeling okay? Any dizziness? Weakness?" "I feel fine, doctor." "Good, but I want you to know that if you need alternative transportation, we can arrange that. We have relationships with medical transport services, and your insurance would cover it." Alternative transportation. The phrase stung because it implied that Eduardo wasn't reliable enough to be my primary transportation. It implied that I couldn't count on my own son to pick me up from medical treatments. It implied that I needed a backup plan for the one person who was supposed to be my backup plan. "He'll be here," I said. "He's never left me stranded before." But even as I said it, I realized it wasn't entirely true. Eduardo had been late before, many times. He'd forgotten appointments before. He'd changed plans at the last minute before. What he'd never done was leave me sitting in a medical facility for hours without explanation. What he'd never done was make me question whether he'd show up at all. At 1:30, I called Eduardo myself. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His outgoing message was casual, almost cheerful. "Hey, you've reached Eduardo. Leave a message and I'll get back to you when I can." When I can. Not when he will. When he can. As if returning phone calls was optional, dependent on his convenience rather than the caller's need. I didn't leave a message. What would I say? "Eduardo, it's your mother. I'm still at dialysis. Where are you?" It would sound pathetic, needy, like an old woman who couldn't manage her own transportation. But wasn't that exactly what I was? An old woman with kidney failure who needed her son to drive her to treatments that kept her alive? The afternoon shift of patients was settling into their chairs when Nancy approached me again. She looked tired, and I realized she'd been staying past her shift to make sure I wasn't abandoned. "Mrs. Rodriguez, it's almost 2 o'clock. Would you like me to call a medical transport service? They could have someone here in 30 minutes. 2 o'clock. Eduardo was 2.5 hours late. 2.5 hours of sitting in a medical facility, watching other families come and go, pretending everything was normal, while my son demonstrated exactly how little my time and comfort meant to him. "Let me try calling him one more time," I said. This time, the phone went straight to voicemail. He'd either turned it off or let the battery die. Either way, the message was clear. Whatever Eduardo was doing was more important than being reachable by his mother who was stranded at a medical facility. I looked around the recovery area, at the empty chairs where other patients had sat briefly before their families took them home. I looked at the parking lot, still empty of blue Hondas. I looked at Nancy, whose shift had ended hours ago, but who was still there because she couldn't bring herself to leave an elderly patient alone. "Okay," I said quietly. "Please call the medical transport." The shame of saying those words was almost physical. After 2 years of Eduardo driving me to dialysis, after all the times I'd told other patients how lucky I was to have such a devoted son, after all the excuses I'd made for his lateness and his attitude, I was asking a stranger to take me home because my own child couldn't be bothered to show up. Nancy squeezed my shoulder gently. "It happens more than you think," she said. "Family members get busy, emergencies come up. Don't feel bad about needing backup transportation." But this wasn't an emergency. If Eduardo had been in an accident, if he'd been hurt, if something terrible had happened, someone would have called the dialysis center. His phone wouldn't have been turned off. This was something else entirely. This was Eduardo deciding that whatever he was doing was more important than his mother. The medical transport van arrived at 2:45. The driver was a middle-aged woman named Carmen, who helped me into the passenger seat and asked about my day while we drove through afternoon traffic. She was kind and professional, exactly the sort of person you'd want to have transporting elderly patients to and from medical appointments. "How long have you been coming to Valley Dialysis?" she asked. 2 years. "That's a good center. My father went there before he passed. The staff really cares about their patients." "They do." Nancy stayed past her shift today to make sure I had a ride home. "She sounds like a keeper. Family member couldn't make it today?" I hesitated. How do you explain that your son simply didn't show up? How do you admit that the person you've spent your entire adult life protecting and supporting and making excuses for just left you sitting in a medical facility for 3 hours without explanation? "He got held up," I said finally. Carmen nodded. "Happens to the best of us. Good thing the center has backup options." When we pulled into my driveway, Eduardo's blue Honda wasn't there. He hadn't beaten me home. He hadn't rushed over to check on me after realizing he'd missed our appointment. Wherever he was, whatever he was doing, it was still more important than his mother. Carmen helped me to my front door and waited while I found my keys. "You take care of yourself," she said. "See you Tuesday if you need a ride." If I needed a ride. As if this might become a regular arrangement. As if Eduardo might not be dependable enough to count on for future appointments. The possibility hadn't occurred to me before. But standing in my doorway watching Carmen drive away, I realized that today might not be an isolated incident. Today might be the beginning of a new pattern, a new level of thoughtlessness, a new way for Eduardo to demonstrate that his convenience mattered more than my needs. Inside my house, everything was exactly as I'd left it that morning. My coffee cup in the sink, my morning medications still on the kitchen counter, the television remote on the coffee table where I'd placed it after watching the early news. Nothing had changed except me. Something fundamental had shifted during those 3 hours in the dialysis center, during that ride home with a stranger, during the walk up my driveway alone. I sat in my living room chair, the same chair where I waited every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday morning for Eduardo to pick me up, and I tried to understand what had happened. Not just today, but over the past months and years. When had Eduardo stopped being reliable? When had I stopped expecting reliability from him? When had I started accepting behavior that I would never tolerate from anyone else? The phone rang at 4:30. Eduardo's name appeared on the caller ID. "Mommy, I'm so sorry," he said before I could even say hello. "I got caught up in something and lost track of time. Are you still at dialysis? I'm on my way." "I've been home for an hour and a half," I said. There was a pause. "How did you get home?" "Medical transport." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm really sorry, Mommy. This was important, and I thought I'd be done in time, but it ran longer than expected. Important. There was that word again. More important than his mother. More important than the routine we'd established. More important than basic human decency. What was so important, Eduardo? "It's complicated. Business stuff. I'll explain. When I see you." Business stuff. Eduardo hadn't had steady business in 6 years, but he always had business stuff that was too complicated to explain, too important to postpone, too urgent to schedule around his mother's medical treatments. "I'm tired," I said. "We'll talk tomorrow." "Mommy, wait." I really am sorry. This won't happen again. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that Eduardo had been saying those exact words to me for years. About being late, about forgetting plans, about disappointing me in small and large ways. This won't happen again, was his signature promise, the one he broke most consistently. I sat in my chair as the afternoon light faded, thinking about the past 3 hours, about Nancy staying late, about Carmen the transport driver, about Dr. Martinez offering alternatives. All of these people, strangers and near strangers, had shown me more consideration and care in one afternoon than my own son had shown me in months. That night, I called my neighbor Patricia. Patricia was 76, a widow like me, and we'd become close friends over the past few years. She had 3 daughters who all lived within 20 miles of her, and they had a schedule for checking on their mother that ran like clockwork. "Maria, how are you feeling after treatment today?" she asked. I told her everything. The 3-hour wait, the medical transport, Eduardo's casual phone call hours later. Patricia listened without interruption, and when I finished, there was a long silence. "Maria," she said finally, "how long has Eduardo been treating you like this?" "Like what?" "Like your time doesn't matter, like your needs are optional, like you're lucky to get whatever scraps of attention he decides to give you." I wanted to defend Eduardo, to explain that he was busy, that he had his own life to manage, that being a caregiver was difficult for adult children. But the words wouldn't come, because Patricia was right. Eduardo had been treating me like my time didn't matter, like my needs were optional, like I should be grateful for whatever minimal effort he chose to make. "He's my son," I said finally. "And you're his mother, the woman who raised him, sacrificed for him, supported him through every failure and disappointment. You deserve better than to be left sitting in a medical facility for 3 hours because he got caught up in something important." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and really looked at my life with Eduardo. Not the fantasy version where he was a devoted son going through a rough patch, but the reality version where I was a 74-year-old woman being taken advantage of by someone who was supposed to love and protect me. When had I become so small in my own son's priorities? When had I started accepting crumbs and calling them bread? When had I stopped believing that I deserved to be treated with basic respect and consideration? That night, I made a decision. Not a dramatic decision, not a life-changing decision, just a small decision about self-respect and boundaries. If Eduardo was going to treat my time as worthless, then maybe it was time to stop giving him access to something he clearly didn't value. But I had no idea that my small decision about self-respect was about to reveal a truth about my son that would change everything. I had no idea that Eduardo's 3-hour disappearance wasn't carelessness, or thoughtlessness, or even cruelty. It was something much worse than that. The next morning, I woke up with a headache that had nothing to do with my kidney condition and everything to do with the restless night I'd spent replaying Eduardo's excuses. "Business stuff," he'd said. "Complicated." Those were his go-to phrases whenever he didn't want to give me a real explanation, and I'd been accepting them for far too long. I made my coffee stronger than usual and sat at my kitchen table with my medication organizer, counting out pills for the week ahead. Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Tuesday. The rhythm of dialysis had become the rhythm of my life, and Eduardo was supposed to be part of that rhythm. Reliable, predictable, present. Yesterday had shattered that illusion completely. My phone rang at 8:15. Eduardo's name on the caller ID made my stomach tighten. "Morning, Mommy. How are you feeling today?" "Tired," I said, which was true, but not complete. I was tired, angry, confused, and starting to see patterns I'd been ignoring for years. "Listen, about yesterday. I want to explain what happened, but I'd rather do it in person. Can I come over this morning?" I almost said yes automatically. the way I always did when Eduardo wanted something from me. But yesterday had changed something fundamental. Yesterday had shown me what it felt like to be completely dismissed by someone who was supposed to care about me. "I have a doctor's appointment this morning," I lied. "Maybe later." "What kind of appointment? Do you need a ride?" The irony wasn't lost on me. Now he was offering rides. Now he was concerned about my medical appointments. Where was this concern yesterday when I was sitting in a dialysis center for 3 hours? "I can manage," I said. There was a pause. Eduardo wasn't used to me being short with him, wasn't used to me not immediately accommodating his schedule. "Okay, well, maybe I'll stop by this afternoon. We need to talk." "We need to talk." Another one of his phrases that usually meant he needed something from me. Money, probably. Eduardo's mysterious errands and important business usually came down to money he didn't have for bills he couldn't pay. After we hung up, I decided to take a walk around my neighborhood. I needed fresh air and perspective, needed to clear my head before Eduardo showed up with whatever explanation he'd manufactured for his disappearance. The morning was crisp and bright, the kind of March day that promised spring was finally coming to Colorado. Mrs. Patterson from the Dialysis Center lived 3 blocks away, and I found myself walking past her house slowly, hoping I might see her outside. I wanted to talk to someone who understood what it was like to depend on family members for transportation, someone who might have insights about managing difficult adult children. She was in her front garden, pulling weeds from around her early tulips. When she saw me, she waved and walked over to the fence between her yard and the sidewalk. "Maria, isn't it? From Dialysis?" "Yes, you have such a beautiful garden." "Thank you. Gardening keeps me busy between treatments." "How are you?" "Feeling? I noticed you were still there when I left yesterday. Everything okay?" The question was casual, but I could hear the genuine concern underneath it. Mrs. Patterson had been through enough medical treatments to recognize when something was wrong with a fellow patient's routine. "My son was delayed," I said. "I had to arrange alternative transportation." Mrs. Patterson nodded knowingly. Family can be complicated. My grandson, the one I mentioned who's graduating college, he's wonderful. But his father, my son-in-law, that's another story entirely. Some people think that because we're older, our time isn't valuable anymore. What do you mean? Well, they'll keep us waiting without thinking twice about it. They'll change plans at the last minute because something better came up. They'll promise to help with something and then conveniently forget. Like we don't have schedules or feelings or dignity that matters. Her words hit me like a physical blow because they described Eduardo's behavior perfectly. The casual lateness, the last-minute cancellations, the promises that evaporated when something better came along. I'd been making excuses for all of it, telling myself that Eduardo was busy, that caregiving was stressful, that I should be grateful for whatever help he provided. "But they're family," I said weakly. "Family should treat us better, not worse. Family should be the people we can count on, especially when we're vulnerable. If a stranger treated you the way some family members do, you'd never speak to that stranger again." I thought about Carmen, the medical transport driver who'd been kinder to me in 30 minutes than Eduardo had been in months. I thought about Nancy, who'd stayed past her shift to make sure I wasn't abandoned. I thought about Dr. Martinez, who'd offered alternatives without making me feel like a burden. Mrs. Patterson was right. Strangers had treated me with more consideration and respect than my own son. We talked for a few more minutes about gardening and the weather, but her words about family expectations stayed with me as I walked home. When I reached my front door, Eduardo's blue Honda was in my driveway. He was early for once, probably because he was anxious to deliver whatever explanation he'd prepared. I found him in my kitchen, making coffee like he lived there. He'd used my good coffee, the expensive blend I saved for special occasions, and he'd made enough for 2 people without asking if I wanted any. These small presumptions had always irritated me, but I'd never said anything. Eduardo had a way of making me feel petty for caring about such minor things. "There you are, Mommy. Where did you go so early?" "I took a walk. It's a beautiful morning." "You should have waited for me. I could have walked with you." But he couldn't have, because he'd been unreachable yesterday when I actually needed him. He couldn't have, because his version of spending time with me usually involved him talking about his problems while I listened and worried and offered solutions he wouldn't take. Eduardo handed me a mug of my own coffee and sat across from me, at my kitchen table. He was dressed casually today, jeans and a t-shirt, his nice clothes from yesterday nowhere to be seen. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept well, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite identify. Guilt, maybe, or calculation. "About yesterday," he began. "I owe you a real explanation." I waited, curious to see what story he'd constructed to justify abandoning me at a medical facility for 3 hours. "I got a call about a job opportunity, a really good one, something that could change everything for me. But I had to meet with the guy right away, yesterday morning, or he was going to offer it to someone else." A job opportunity. Eduardo had been chasing job opportunities for 6 years, each one more promising than the last, each one requiring immediate action that coincidentally conflicted with his responsibilities to me. What kind of job? Sales, high-end stuff, luxury cars. The commission potential is incredible, Mommy. This could be the break I've been waiting for. Eduardo had worked in car sales twice before. The first time, he'd quit after 3 months because his manager was unreasonable. The second time, he'd been let go after 6 weeks for missing too many days. But he always talked about sales jobs like they were lottery tickets, certain that the next one would make him rich. And this meeting took 3 hours? Well, first I met with the sales manager. Then he wanted me to meet the owner. Then they had me do a test drive with a potential customer to see how I handled the interaction. It was a whole process, but I think I got the job. The story was plausible enough, detailed enough to sound real. But something about Eduardo's delivery felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced these explanations in front of a mirror, and there were gaps that didn't make sense. "Why didn't you answer your phone when I called?" "My phone died during the meeting. I didn't want to interrupt everything to find a charger." "And you couldn't call the dialysis center to let them know you'd be late?" "I thought I'd be done in time. I really thought I'd make it back before your treatment finished." Every answer was reasonable on its surface, but together they painted a picture of someone who'd prioritized a job interview over his mother's medical needs. Someone who'd made a series of choices that all favored his convenience over my well-being. "Eduardo," I said carefully, "this is the 3rd time this month you've been significantly late picking me up from dialysis." "3rd time? Come on, Mommy. It's not that bad. 2 weeks ago, you were 45 minutes late because you stopped to look at apartments. Last week, you were an hour late because you forgot what time my treatment ended. Yesterday, you were 3 hours late for a job interview you didn't mention until today." Eduardo shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wasn't used to me keeping track of his failures, wasn't used to me presenting evidence of his unreliability. "I'm doing my best here, Mommy. Taking care of you isn't easy. I have my own life to manage, too." Taking care of me. As if driving me to medical treatments 3 times a week was some enormous burden rather than the bare minimum of what a son should do for his mother. As if I should be grateful for his sporadic, unreliable assistance instead of expecting basic competence and consideration. "I never asked you to take care of me," I said quietly. "I asked you to drive me to dialysis." "That's not the same thing." "What's the difference?" Taking care of someone means making their well-being a priority. Driving someone to dialysis means showing up when you say you will and being there when treatment ends. You've been doing the second thing, barely, but you haven't been doing the first thing at all. Eduardo stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. In his mind, showing up most of the time and eventually getting me home was taking care of me. The idea that I might need more than that, might deserve more than that, seemed to genuinely confuse him. Look, I'm sorry about yesterday, okay? But this job could be really important for both of us. If I start making good money, I can help you more. Maybe we could even look into getting you a car. A car. I was 74 years old with kidney failure, and Eduardo thought the solution to his unreliability was for me to drive myself to medical treatments. The suggestion was so absurd that I almost laughed. Eduardo, I haven't driven in 2 years. My reflexes aren't what they used to be, and dialysis leaves me tired and sometimes dizzy. Even if I could drive safely, who would help me if something went wrong during treatment? They have staff for that. Staff isn't family. Staff doesn't know my medical history or my preferences or how to advocate for me if something goes wrong. So what do you want me to do? Turn down job opportunities so I can be your personal chauffeur? Personal chauffeur. That's how Eduardo saw his role in my medical care. Not as a son helping his mother through a health crisis, not as family, providing essential support, but as a chauffeur whose services I was lucky to receive. I want you to be reliable, I said. I want you to show up when you say you will and be there when I need you. I want you to understand that my medical treatments aren't optional social events that can be rescheduled around your convenience. I am reliable. Yesterday was unusual circumstances. Eduardo, you've been late or absent or distracted for months. Yesterday wasn't unusual circumstances. Yesterday was you finally showing me exactly how little my needs matter to you. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they were true. For months, maybe years, Eduardo had been demonstrating through his actions that my time, my comfort, my medical needs were secondary to whatever else was happening in his life. Yesterday had just been the most extreme example of a pattern I'd been refusing to see. Eduardo stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. This is ridiculous, Mommy. I'm trying to build a career, trying to make something of myself, and all you can do is complain about being a few minutes late here and there. 3 hours isn't a few minutes. Fine, 3 hours, one time. And I apologized. You apologized for getting caught, not for leaving me stranded. I didn't leave you stranded. You got home fine. I got home because strangers helped me. Because a nurse stayed past her shift and a medical transport driver treated me with more consideration than my own son. Eduardo grabbed his keys from the counter, his movements sharp and angry. You know what, Mommy? Maybe you should use medical transport from now on. Maybe that would be easier for both of us. The suggestion hit me like a slap. Eduardo was offering to abandon his caregiving responsibilities entirely, rather than acknowledge that his behavior had been unacceptable. Rather than commit to being more reliable, he was suggesting I find other arrangements. Is that what you want? I asked. I want you to stop acting like I'm the worst son in the world because I had one bad day. One bad day, Eduardo? Let me tell you about my bad days. My bad days are when I can't eat solid food because my stomach is rejecting everything. My bad days are when I'm so tired from treatment that I can barely walk from the car to my front door. My bad days are when I sit in a medical facility wondering if my son cares enough about me to show up. Eduardo stopped at the kitchen doorway. His back still turned to me. Of course I care about you. Then act like it. Don't tell me you care while treating me like an inconvenience. Don't say you love me while demonstrating that everything else in your life is more important than I am. He turned around then, and I saw something in his face that I'd never seen before. Not guilt or shame or even anger. Something colder, more calculating. Something that made me wonder if I really knew my son at all. What do you want from me, Mommy? Do you want me to give up every opportunity, every chance to improve my life, just to make sure I'm never 5 minutes late picking you up from dialysis? I want you to find a balance. I want you to prioritize appropriately. I want you to understand That when someone depends on you for something as essential as medical transportation, you don't get to be casual about it. And if I can't do that? If I can't be the perfect son you apparently need? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to consider. Eduardo was asking me to choose between accepting his unreliable, inconsiderate treatment or losing his help entirely. He was presenting those as my only two options, as if expecting basic reliability from family was unreasonable. "I guess we'll have to figure that out," I said. Eduardo nodded once, sharply, and walked out of my kitchen without another word. I heard my front door close, heard his car start, heard him back out of my driveway with more speed than necessary. The silence he left behind felt different from the usual quiet of my house. It felt final somehow, like something between us had broken that couldn't be easily repaired. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after he left, staring at the coffee mug he'd abandoned, thinking about the conversation we'd just had. Eduardo had come here to explain yesterday's abandonment, but instead he'd revealed something much more troubling. He genuinely didn't understand why his behavior was unacceptable. In his mind, I was being unreasonable for expecting reliability. I was being demanding for wanting basic consideration. When had we gotten to this point? When had Eduardo started seeing me as a burden rather than his mother? When had I become someone whose needs were negotiable rather than essential? I thought about Mrs. Patterson's words about family treating us worse than strangers would. I thought about Carmen's kindness, Nancy's professionalism, Dr. Martinez's concern. All of these people had shown me more respect in one afternoon than Eduardo had shown me in months. That afternoon, I called Valley Dialysis Center and asked to speak with Nancy. "Mrs. Rodriguez, how are you feeling today?" "I'm fine, Nancy. I wanted to ask you about the medical transport service you mentioned yesterday. How does that work exactly?" There was a pause. Nancy was too professional to ask why I needed this information, but I could hear the question in her silence. "Well, it's pretty straightforward. We can set up regular transportation for your treatment days, or you can call as needed. Your insurance covers it as medical necessity transportation. The drivers are all trained in working with dialysis patients. And they're reliable?" "Very reliable. More reliable than family members, to be honest. They don't have competing priorities or personal dramas. They just focus on getting patients to and from treatment safely and on time." More reliable than family members. Nancy had probably seen hundreds of patients over the years, had probably watched countless family dynamics play out in her dialysis center. Her assessment wasn't a criticism of Eduardo specifically, but it stung anyway because it was accurate. What would I need to do to set up regular transportation? "Just let me know which days you want it scheduled and I'll handle the paperwork. We can start as soon as tomorrow if you need." Tomorrow was Thursday. I had dialysis every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. 3 days a week that I'd been depending on Eduardo to be responsible, reliable, present. 3 days a week that I'd been setting myself up for disappointment. "Let me think about it," I said. "I'll let you know." But I already knew what I was going to do. Eduardo had made it clear that being my transportation was a burden he resented, a responsibility that interfered with his more important priorities. If that's how he felt, then maybe it was time to remove that burden from his shoulders entirely. That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and really examined my relationship with Eduardo. Not the relationship I wished we had. Not the relationship I remembered from when he was younger, but the relationship that actually existed right now, today, between a 74-year-old woman with kidney failure and her 38-year-old son. Eduardo called me when he needed money, which was often. He visited when he was lonely or bored or wanted home-cooked food. He drove me to dialysis when it was convenient for him and made excuses when it wasn't. He talked about his problems for hours while showing minimal interest in mine. He made promises he didn't keep and offered explanations that didn't quite add up. When I laid it out like that, Without the emotional buffer of maternal love and hope and denial, the picture was pretty clear. Eduardo wasn't taking care of me. I was taking care of him, financially and emotionally, while he provided minimal, unreliable assistance in return. But what hurt most wasn't the imbalance. What hurt was the realization that Eduardo seemed to feel entitled to this arrangement. He didn't act grateful for my financial support or apologetic about his unreliability. He acted like I owed him my help while he owed me nothing more than showing up when convenient. That night, I called Patricia and told her about my conversation with Eduardo. "He offered to stop driving you entirely rather than commit to being more reliable?" she asked. "He said maybe medical transport would be easier for both of us." "Easier for him, you mean? He's trying to manipulate you into backing down from your perfectly reasonable expectations." "Maybe I am being too demanding. Maybe I should be more understanding about the pressures he's facing." "Maria, listen. To me, you are not being demanding. You are asking your son to show up when he says he will for your medical treatments. That is literally the bare minimum of what family members do for each other." "But he's all I have, Patricia. If I push too hard, if I make this into a bigger conflict, I might lose him entirely." "Honey, what exactly would you be losing? Someone who shows up when convenient, leaves you stranded when something better comes along, and makes you feel guilty for having basic expectations. That's not support. That's emotional manipulation." Patricia was right, but acknowledging that meant acknowledging that my relationship with my son was fundamentally broken. It meant admitting that Eduardo didn't prioritize my well-being, didn't respect my time, didn't value me the way I'd always valued him. "What should I do?" I asked. "Stop making his unreliability your problem to solve. Set up your own transportation. Stop depending on someone who's shown you repeatedly that you can't depend on him." After we hung up, I sat in the dark thinking about dependency and dignity and self-respect. I'd been so afraid of losing Eduardo's help that I'd accepted increasingly unacceptable behavior. I'd been so focused on maintaining our relationship that I'd forgotten to maintain my own standards. Eduardo didn't call that night, which was unusual. Normally, after we had any kind of disagreement, he'd call within a few hours to smooth things over, to make sure I wasn't too upset, to ensure that whatever conflict we'd had wouldn't affect his access to my financial support. His silence felt ominous somehow, like he was making calculations I couldn't see. Friday morning, I called Nancy back. "I'd like to set up regular medical transport for all of my dialysis appointments," I said, "starting with tomorrow's treatment." "Of course, Mrs. Rodriguez. I'll handle all the arrangements. Will this be permanent or temporary?" Permanent or temporary? The question implied that I might change my mind, might go back to depending on Eduardo once this conflict blew over. But something fundamental had shifted in me during yesterday's conversation. I'd seen something in Eduardo's face, heard something in his voice, that I couldn't unsee or unhear. "Let's say permanent for now," I said. That afternoon, Eduardo finally called. "Mommy, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Maybe I was a little defensive." A little defensive? That was Eduardo's version of an apology, acknowledging that his reaction might have been slightly unreasonable while avoiding any admission that his behavior had been unacceptable. "I've been thinking too," I said. "Good. Look, I want to make this work. Maybe we can figure out a better system for communication. Make sure these scheduling conflicts don't happen again." Scheduling conflicts. Eduardo was still framing his abandonment of me as a mutual problem that we needed to solve together, rather than his failure to meet a basic responsibility. "I've arranged for medical transport to handle my dialysis appointments," I said. There was a long pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've set up regular transportation through the dialysis center. You don't need to drive me anymore." "Mommy, that's not necessary. We can work this out. I think this is better for both of us. You won't have to worry about scheduling conflicts, and I won't have to worry about being stranded." "You weren't stranded. You got home fine." Eduardo, I sat in a medical facility for 3 hours after a 4-hour treatment because you decided something else was more important. That's the definition of being stranded. It was one time. It was the last time. I'm not putting myself in that position again. Another long pause. I could practically hear Eduardo calculating, trying to figure out how this change would affect him. He was probably wondering if my decision to arrange my own transportation meant I was also reconsidering my financial support for him. Well, if that's what you want, he said finally. I guess it does free up my schedule. Free up his schedule. My medical needs had been an inconvenient obligation that he was relieved to escape. Eduardo wasn't disappointed that I no longer needed his help. He was glad to be released from a responsibility he'd never wanted in the first place. I guess it does, I agreed. So we're good then? No hard feelings? No hard feelings. Eduardo wanted reassurance that this conflict wouldn't have lasting consequences for him, that I wasn't holding grudges that might affect his access to my support and resources. We're good, I said, but I wasn't sure we were good at all. I wasn't sure we'd been good for a long time. Saturday morning, my first dialysis appointment with medical transport, Carmen picked me up at 6:45 sharp. She was the same driver who'd brought me home on Tuesday, and she greeted me like an old friend. How are you feeling today, Maria? Better, thank you. Ready to get this treatment over with. That's the spirit. Nice that you don't have to worry about coordinating with family members anymore. Sometimes it's easier to just handle your own arrangements. Carmen probably transported dozens of elderly patients every week, probably saw all kinds of family dynamics and reliability issues. Her comment wasn't judgmental, just observational, but it reinforced what I was beginning to understand about my situation with Eduardo. At the dialysis center, Nancy greeted me with a smile. How was your first ride with medical transport? Very smooth. Carmen is wonderful. She's one of our best drivers, very reliable, very caring. You'll be in good hands. Reliable. Caring. Two qualities I'd thought I could count on from Eduardo, but had been disappointed by repeatedly. Two qualities that strangers were providing more consistently than my own son. During my treatment, I watched the familiar rhythm of the dialysis center. Patients arriving, getting connected to machines, sitting for hours while their blood was cleaned, getting disconnected, leaving with family members or transport services. Everyone had their routine, their support system, their way of managing this necessary but difficult part of their lives. Mrs. Patterson was in her usual chair, 2 spots down from mine. Her daughter had arrived early and was sitting beside her, talking quietly about weekend plans. The love and care between them was obvious, comfortable, natural. They weren't performing dutiful family interactions. They were genuinely enjoying each other's company. I tried to remember the last time Eduardo had seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with me, the last time our interactions had felt natural rather than obligatory, the last time he'd asked about my day without needing something from me, the last time he'd shared something about his life without it being a request for advice or financial help. I couldn't remember. Our relationship had become entirely transactional. He provided minimal, unreliable assistance with transportation, and I provided financial support, emotional support, and a home-cooked meal whenever he was hungry. The balance was so lopsided that I'd stopped seeing it clearly, stopped recognizing how little I was receiving in return for everything I was giving. When Carmen picked me up after treatment, she asked about my weekend plans. Nothing special. Quiet weekend at home. That sounds nice. Sometimes quiet weekends are the best kind. Family coming to visit? Probably not this weekend. Carmen nodded without pressing for details. She probably transported enough elderly patients to recognize the tone that meant family relationships were complicated. She probably heard enough stories to know that adult children didn't always prioritize their aging parents the way they should. That weekend, Eduardo didn't call or visit. Usually, he checked in at least once over the weekend, often stopping by for dinner on Sunday if he didn't have other plans. His absence felt deliberate, like he was punishing me for arranging my own transportation, for no longer needing him in the way I used to. But instead of feeling abandoned, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Relief that I didn't have to worry about whether Eduardo would show up for Tuesday's dialysis appointment. Relief that I didn't have to manage his moods or make excuses for his lateness. Relief that I could count on Carmen and the medical transport service to be professional, punctual, and focused on my needs rather than their own convenience. Sunday evening, Patricia called to check on me. "How was your first weekend of independence?" "Quiet. Eduardo hasn't called since I told him about the transportation arrangements." "He's probably sulking. Men like Eduardo don't like it when their mothers stop needing them, especially when they weren't meeting those needs very well in the first place." "Do you think I made the right decision?" "Maria, you made the only decision that preserved your dignity and safety. Eduardo showed you that you couldn't depend on him for something as basic as medical transportation. You found a solution that doesn't require you to beg for basic consideration from someone who should be providing it freely." Monday morning, Eduardo finally called. "Mommy, I wanted to check on you. How did Saturday go with the transport service?" "It went fine. Very smooth." "Good, good. Listen, I've been thinking, and I realize I might have been taking some things for granted. Maybe I could still drive you sometimes when my schedule allows." When his schedule allows. Eduardo was offering to occasionally provide transportation as a favor to me, rather than acknowledging that regular, reliable transportation to medical treatments should be a given. He was positioning himself as generous for offering to sometimes do what he should have been doing consistently all along. "The transport service is working out well," I said. "I think I'll stick with that arrangement." "Are you sure? I mean, it seems impersonal. These drivers don't know you like I do." Eduardo was right that the drivers didn't know me like he did. But that was part of what made them better at their job. They didn't bring personal drama or competing priorities to our interactions. They didn't make me feel guilty for needing transportation or resentful for depending on them. They treated me with professional courtesy and respect, which had become more than I could expect from my own son. "I'm comfortable with the arrangement," I said. "Okay, well, maybe I could come by for dinner this week. I haven't seen you since our talk on Thursday." Dinner. Eduardo was trying to reestablish our regular routine, to make sure that his failure as a transportation provider didn't affect his access to my cooking, my company, and probably my financial support. "I'm not sure about this week," I said. "I've been tired after treatments lately." It wasn't entirely true. I had been tired, but not more than usual. What was true was that I needed space to figure out how I felt about Eduardo, about our relationship, about the future. I needed time to process what had happened without the pressure of pretending everything was normal. "Oh, okay. Well, maybe next week then. Maybe." After we hung up, I realized that for the first time in years, I had said no to Eduardo about something he wanted, not no to giving him money, which I'd done occasionally when his requests were too outrageous. But no to spending time with him, no to providing the emotional support and domestic comfort he'd come to expect from me. It felt strange, almost foreign. I'd spent so many years accommodating Eduardo's needs and schedules and moods that setting a boundary felt like speaking a language I'd forgotten how to use. But it also felt necessary, like something I should have done a long time ago. That week, I settled into my new routine with medical transport. Carmen picked me up on Tuesday. A different driver named Robert handled Thursday, and Carmen was back for Saturday. All 3 rides were punctual, professional, and stress-free. No waiting, no wondering if my ride would show up, no managing someone else's mood or schedule. The difference was remarkable. For 2 years, I'd accepted Eduardo's unreliability as normal, had adjusted my expectations to accommodate his limitations. I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply count on transportation, being there when I needed it. But Eduardo's absence from my week felt significant too. No random phone calls, no unexpected visits, no requests for money or advice or sympathy. It was the longest we'd gone without contact since his father died, and I couldn't decide if that worried me or relieved me. Thursday evening, while I was preparing a simple dinner for one, my doorbell rang. Eduardo's blue Honda was in my driveway, and he was standing on my front porch with a grocery bag and what looked like flowers from the supermarket. "Surprise, Mommy, I brought ingredients for your favorite meal." My favorite meal was actually a dish my late husband had loved, but Eduardo had never paid enough attention to remember that distinction. The gesture was thoughtful in theory, but it felt calculated, like he'd decided that a grand romantic gesture would smooth over our recent conflict. "Eduardo, I told you I was tired this week." "I know, but I thought maybe if I did the cooking, we could still spend some time together. I miss you, Mommy." "I miss you." The words should have melted my heart, should have made me forget about transportation problems and reliability issues. But instead, they made me wonder when exactly Eduardo had started missing me. Had he missed me during the 3 hours I sat in the dialysis center? Had he missed me during the weekend when he didn't call? Or did he miss me now because he was realizing that his access to my support might not be as guaranteed as he'd assumed? I let him in because turning him away felt too harsh, too final. But as I watched him move around my kitchen, using my cookware and ingredients he'd chosen without asking what I actually wanted to eat, I felt like I was watching a performance rather than experiencing genuine care. Eduardo talked while he cooked, telling me about his week, his job prospects, his various frustrations and disappointments. He didn't ask about my dialysis treatments, didn't inquire about how the medical transport was working out, didn't seem curious about how I was adjusting to our new arrangement. The conversation was entirely focused on him, his needs, his experiences, his problems. This had always been the pattern of our interactions, but I was noticing it now in a way I hadn't before. Eduardo treated me like a combination therapist and audience, someone who existed to listen to his problems and provide support and validation. He didn't treat me like a person with my own experiences worth discussing. During dinner, he brought up the job opportunity that had supposedly caused his disappearance the previous Tuesday. "I'm still waiting to hear back from them. The sales manager said he'd call by the end of the week, but that was last week, so who knows." "Did you follow up with them?" "I don't want to seem desperate. These things take time." Eduardo's approach to job searching had always mystified me. He'd get excited about opportunities, talk about them like they were sure things, and then wait passively for other people to make decisions about his future. He never seemed to understand that following up was professional, not desperate, or that his financial situation didn't allow him the luxury of playing hard to get with potential employers. "Maybe you could call tomorrow just to check on the timeline," I suggested. "Maybe. We'll see." "We'll see." Another of Eduardo's favorite phrases, meaning he had no intention of taking my advice but didn't want to argue about it. Eduardo asked for my opinions constantly but rarely acted on them, which made me wonder why he bothered asking in the first place. After dinner, Eduardo settled into my living room like he planned to stay for hours. He turned on the television, found a sports program, and made himself comfortable on my sofa. The presumption bothered me more than it should have. He hadn't asked if I wanted to watch television, hadn't inquired about my evening plans, hadn't considered that I might want quiet time or early sleep after a dialysis day. "Eduardo, I'm pretty tired tonight. Maybe we should call it an evening." He looked surprised, like the idea. The decision came to me on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 1 month after Eduardo had left me stranded at the dialysis center. I was sitting in my kitchen, having coffee and sorting through the mail, when I found the property tax assessment for my house. The number made me pause and really think about the value of everything I owned, everything I'd worked for, everything I'd planned to leave behind. My house was worth more than I'd realized. The neighborhood had improved significantly over the past decade, and property values had risen accordingly. Combined with my savings account, my retirement investments, and the life insurance policy from my late husband's employer, I was looking at a substantial estate. Money that could make a real difference in someone's life. Money that could provide security and opportunities for the right person. But who was the right person? For 38 years, I'd assumed it would be Eduardo. He was my only child, my flesh and blood, the person I'd sacrificed for and worried about and supported through every challenge and setback. Leaving everything to him had seemed so automatic, so natural, that I'd never seriously considered any alternative. Until now. I set down the property assessment and really thought about what Eduardo would do with an inheritance. Based on his track record with money, his approach to responsibility, his pattern of making poor decisions and expecting other people to fix the consequences, I had a pretty clear picture. He'd probably quit whatever job he had at the time, spend freely without budgeting or planning, and burn through everything within a few years. The money I'd spent a lifetime accumulating would be gone, wasted on Eduardo's immediate gratification rather than invested in his long-term security. But worse than the financial waste was the moral implication. By leaving everything to Eduardo, I'd be rewarding his treatment of me over the past few years. I'd be telling him that abandoning me at medical facilities, treating me like an inconvenience, showing me no respect or consideration, was acceptable behavior that came with no real consequences. I'd be teaching him that blood relation was enough to guarantee inheritance, regardless of how he'd treated the person providing that inheritance. That afternoon, I called my lawyer. Stephen Morrison had handled my legal affairs for over 15 years, ever since my husband died. He was a calm, methodical man in his 60s who specialized in estate planning and had helped dozens of elderly clients navigate complicated family situations. "Maria, good to hear from you. How can I help?" "You today?" "I'd like to make some changes to my will." "Of course. What kind of changes are we talking about?" I hesitated, realizing that saying the words out loud would make this decision real and irreversible. "I want to remove my son as the primary beneficiary." There was a pause. Stephen had probably heard similar requests before, but he was too professional to react with surprise or judgment. "That's certainly your right, Maria. May I ask what's prompting this change?" I told him about the dialysis incident, about Eduardo's pattern of unreliability, about the way he'd treated me when I'd tried to address the problem. Stephen listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and specific incidents. "And this isn't a temporary disagreement? You've thought this through carefully?" "I've been thinking about it for weeks. This isn't about punishment, Stephen. It's about recognizing that Eduardo isn't the person I'd raised him to be, and he's not someone I can trust to handle a significant inheritance responsibly." "Understood. Do you have someone else in mind as your primary beneficiary?" I did, actually. Over the past few weeks, as I'd been processing my feelings about Eduardo, I'd also been noticing other people in my life who'd shown me kindness and consideration. People who treated me with respect, who demonstrated character and integrity in their daily actions. "Isabel Morales," I said. "She's my neighbor Patricia's daughter. She's 28, a teacher, married with 2 young children. She's been incredibly kind to me over the past few years." Stephen made notes while I explained about Isabel, how she'd helped me with grocery shopping when I was too weak after treatments, how she'd shoveled my sidewalk during winter storms, without being asked, how she'd brought her children over to visit, understanding that elderly people needed connection and joy in their lives, how she'd never asked me for anything but had consistently offered help and companionship. "Isabel, sounds like a wonderful young woman," Stephen said. "But are you sure about making such a significant change? Perhaps you could reduce Eduardo's inheritance rather than eliminating it entirely? I'd considered that option, but it felt like a compromise that would satisfy no one. Eduardo would feel cheated out of what he considered his birthright, and I'd still be rewarding his poor treatment of me with a substantial financial gift. Either I believed he'd earned an inheritance through his behavior toward me, or I didn't. There was no middle ground that made moral sense. No, I want Eduardo removed entirely. I want everything to go to Isabel. Everything? The house, the savings, the investments, the insurance proceeds. Everything. Isabel has 2 small children and a teacher's salary. That money could pay for their college educations, help with a down payment on a house, provide security for their family. Eduardo would waste it within 5 years. Stephen scheduled an appointment for the following week to draft the new will. He explained the legal requirements, the witnesses we'd need, the steps to ensure the document would be uncontestable. He also warned me that disinheriting an only child could lead to legal challenges, even if the will was properly executed. Eduardo could argue that you weren't mentally competent when you made these changes, or that someone influenced you inappropriately. Are you prepared for that possibility? Eduardo hasn't paid enough attention to my mental state to know whether I'm competent or not, and no one has influenced me except Eduardo himself, through his own actions. That weekend, I visited Patricia to tell her about my decision. I'd been putting off this conversation because I wasn't sure how she'd react to her daughter suddenly becoming wealthy because of my family problems. "You want to leave your entire estate to Isabel?" Patricia said, setting down her coffee cup with a small clink. "Maria, that's incredibly generous, but are you sure? That's a life-changing amount of money." "That's exactly why I want it to. Go to someone who'll use it wisely." Isabel is building a life, raising children, contributing to her community. She deserves security and opportunities. But Eduardo is your son. Eduardo is my son, but he's not my responsibility anymore. I raised him, supported him, gave him every advantage I could afford. What he's done with those advantages is his choice. What I do with my money is mine. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what I was telling her. Isabel doesn't know about this, does she? No, and I don't want her to know until after I'm gone. I don't want this to change our relationship or make her feel obligated to me in any way. She'll be shocked. She's never expected anything like this. That's part of why she deserves it. She's been kind to me without any expectation of reward. She's shown me the respect and consideration that Eduardo should have shown but didn't. The following Tuesday, Stephen and I met at his office to draft the new will. He'd prepared all the necessary paperwork, and we went through each section carefully, making sure every detail was correct. Isabel would inherit the house, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, the life insurance proceeds, everything. Eduardo would receive nothing except my wedding ring from his father, which seemed appropriate since it was the only thing connecting him to his family heritage. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Maria?" Stephen asked as we prepared to sign the documents. "Once this is executed, it becomes your legal will. Eduardo will have no claim to your estate." "I'm certain." I signed the new will with 2 witnesses present, both employees from Stephen's law firm who didn't know me personally and had no stake in my family dynamics. The process was quick and businesslike, but it felt momentous. With a few signatures, I'd fundamentally changed the trajectory of 2 families, ensuring that my life's work would benefit people who'd earned it through their character rather than their genetics. That evening, Eduardo called. He'd been checking in more frequently since our confrontation, probably sensing that something had shifted in our relationship and wanting to manage whatever damage might affect his future prospects. "How are you? Feeling, Mommy? How was dialysis today?" "Fine. The transport service continues to work well." "Good. Good. Listen, I've been thinking about maybe taking you to dinner this weekend. That little Italian place you like." The offer surprised me. Eduardo rarely suggested activities that focused on my preferences, and he'd never volunteered to spend money on taking me out to eat. The gesture felt calculated, like he was working to rebuild goodwill for reasons I couldn't quite identify. That's thoughtful, but I'm not sure I'm up for it. I've been tired lately. Come on, Mommy. It would be good for you to get out, have a nice meal, spend some time together. My treat. His treat. Eduardo, who'd been unemployed or underemployed for months, who'd been asking me for financial help regularly, was offering to pay for dinner at a restaurant that was expensive by my standards. Where had this sudden financial generosity come from? Where are you getting money for expensive dinners, Eduardo? I've been picking up some freelance work. Nothing major, but enough to cover a nice dinner for my mother. Freelance work. This was the first I'd heard of any employment, freelance or otherwise. Eduardo usually shared every detail of his job prospects and financial situation, partly because he knew I worried about his stability, and partly because he often needed my help managing whatever income he did have. What kind of freelance work? Marketing stuff, social media consulting. It's temporary, but it pays okay. The explanation was vague enough to be suspicious. Eduardo had never shown any aptitude for marketing or social media, had never mentioned interest in that field, had never demonstrated the self-discipline required for freelance work. But he seemed determined to convince me that he was suddenly financially stable enough to treat me to dinner. I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll stay home this weekend. You sure? We haven't spent much time together lately. I've been dealing with some fatigue issues. Maybe another time. Eduardo accepted my refusal more easily than I'd expected, which seemed odd. Usually, when he had an agenda, he was more persistent about getting what he wanted. His casual acceptance of my decline made me wonder if the dinner invitation had been a test of some kind, a way to gauge my mood or my willingness to spend time with him. Over the next few weeks, Eduardo's behavior became increasingly puzzling. He called more frequently but for shorter conversations. He offered to help with tasks around the house but seemed relieved when I declined. He mentioned future plans that included me but in vague, non-committal ways. It felt like he was going through the motions of being an attentive son without actually wanting to invest the time or effort required. Meanwhile, my life without depending on Eduardo for transportation had settled into a comfortable routine. Carmen and the other medical transport drivers had become familiar, friendly presences in my week. They asked about my health, remembered details from previous conversations, and treated me with consistent professionalism and warmth. The reliability was remarkable after months of Eduardo's unpredictability. Isabel continued to be a bright spot in my week. She stopped by every few days, usually with her children, bringing energy and laughter into my quiet house. She never stayed too long or asked for anything beyond conversation and maybe a glass of water for the kids. Her visits felt natural, unforced, genuinely caring. One afternoon in early May, Isabel found me in my backyard, pulling weeds from the flower, beds that had been my husband's pride and joy. I'd been neglecting the garden since his death, but spring had inspired me to try maintaining it again. Those roses are gorgeous, Mrs. Rodriguez. You have such a green thumb. My husband planted those. I'm just trying to keep them alive. Well, you're doing a beautiful job. Would you like some help? I love gardening, and the kids could play in your backyard while we work. We spent the afternoon working side by side, pulling weeds, pruning dead branches, planning what to plant in the empty spaces. Isabel's children played on my old swing set, the one Eduardo had used 30 years ago. Their laughter filled the yard with life and joy that had been missing for too long. Mrs. Rodriguez, can I ask you something personal? Isabel said as we finished up. Of course, dear. My mom mentioned that you and your son have been having some difficulties. I hope I'm not overstepping, but I wanted you to know that if you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. You've been so kind to our family. I looked at this young woman, her clothes dirty from gardening, Her children happy and tired from playing, her face open and concerned about an elderly neighbor's well-being. The contrast with Eduardo's self-centered approach to our relationship was stark and painful. Thank you, Isabel. That means more to me than you know. That evening, I called Stephen to make one small addition to my will. I wanted to include a letter explaining my decision, something that would make my reasoning clear if anyone ever questioned my mental competence or the circumstances surrounding the inheritance change. A letter is a good idea, Stephen agreed. It demonstrates that this decision was carefully considered, not impulsive or influenced by temporary emotions. I spent several evenings writing and rewriting the letter, trying to explain my choice in terms that would be fair to Eduardo while being honest about his behavior. I wrote about the dialysis incident, but also about the larger pattern of disrespect and unreliability. I wrote about Isabel's kindness, but also about her character and the positive impact the inheritance could have on her family. The hardest part was writing about love. Because I did love Eduardo, despite everything. But I'd finally learned that love without respect wasn't healthy for either of us. By continuing to enable his irresponsible behavior, by accepting his poor treatment of me, I'd been teaching him that love meant having no standards or boundaries. That wasn't love. That was codependency. In my letter, I wrote, I am not punishing Eduardo by removing him from my will. I am protecting my legacy by ensuring it goes to someone who will honor it. I am setting a boundary that says treating people poorly has consequences, even when those people love you unconditionally, especially when those people love you unconditionally. On one evening in late May, Eduardo showed up at my door unexpectedly. He seemed agitated, more energetic than usual, and he was dressed in his nice clothes again. The same outfit he'd worn on the day he'd abandoned me at dialysis. Mommy, I have great news. Remember that job opportunity I told you about? The car sales position? I remember you mentioning it. Well, they finally called me back. Not only do I have the job, but they're starting me at a higher commission rate than usual because of my experience and potential. Eduardo's excitement felt forced, performative. He was working too hard to convince me of something, but I wasn't sure what. That's wonderful, Eduardo. When do you start? Monday. But here's the thing, there's an opportunity to make even more money right away. They have this incentive program for new salespeople, but I need to invest some money up front to qualify for the higher commission structure. And there it was. The real reason for Eduardo's visit, for his excitement, for his sudden focus on our relationship over the past few weeks. He needed money, probably more money than he'd ever asked for before, and he'd been laying groundwork to ensure I'd be willing to provide it. How much money, Eduardo? $5,000. I know it sounds like a lot, but I'll be able to pay you back within 2 months, guaranteed. This job is going to change everything for me, Mommy. $5,000, more than Eduardo had ever asked for at one time, but not more than I could afford. 6 months ago, I probably would have said yes. I would have been so excited about Eduardo's apparent success, so hopeful that this job would finally stabilize his life, that I would have given him the money without hesitation. But now I saw the request differently. Eduardo had spent weeks rebuilding our relationship just enough to make this ask. He'd been more attentive, more considerate, more present, not because he'd genuinely changed, but because he'd been planning to request a substantial sum of money. The timing wasn't coincidental. Eduardo had been managing me, manipulating my emotions and expectations to set up this moment. Eduardo, you've asked me for money for job opportunities before. Remember the real estate licensing course? The personal training certification? The business partnership with your friend Marcus? This is different, Mommy. This is a real company with a proven track record. I'm not asking you to fund some pipe dream. This is a legitimate investment in my future. Where exactly does this $5,000 go? What specifically are you investing in? Eduardo's explanation was complicated and full of industry jargon that sounded impressive but didn't make much practical sense. Something about exclusive client lists and premium inventory access and guaranteed sales territories. The more he talked, the more it sounded like a sophisticated version of the get-rich-quick schemes he'd fallen for before. Can you show me some paperwork? Employment contracts? Company literature? Something that explains this opportunity in writing? It's all verbal right now. They want to move fast to get me started. That's why I need the money by Friday. By Friday. Eduardo was creating artificial urgency, trying to pressure me into making a decision without time to research or ask questions. This was exactly the kind of high-pressure tactics that legitimate employers didn't use. Eduardo, this sounds like a scam. It's not a scam, Mommy. This is my chance to finally get ahead, to build a real career. But I need your help to make it happen. What happens if I say no? Eduardo's demeanor shifted, his enthusiasm fading into something harder, more calculating. I guess I'd have to find the money somewhere else. Maybe take out a loan, pay high interest rates, struggle to get ahead because my own mother wouldn't help me when I needed it most. There it was. The guilt trip, the emotional manipulation, the suggestion that my refusal to fund his questionable business opportunity would be a betrayal of our relationship. Eduardo was using my love for him as leverage to extract money for what sounded, increasingly, like a scam or pyramid scheme. Eduardo, if this opportunity is as good as you say it is, any legitimate lending institution would be happy to provide a $5,000 loan to someone with a guaranteed high-income job. Banks don't understand opportunities like this. They're conservative, slow, bureaucratic. By the time I got approved for a loan, the opportunity would be gone. Then maybe it's not the right opportunity. Eduardo stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not disappointment or frustration or even anger. Something colder, more detached. Like he was seeing me clearly for the first time and didn't like what he saw. So that's it? After everything I've done for you, everything, I've sacrificed to take care of you. You're going to let me miss out on this chance because you don't trust my judgment. Everything he'd done for me, everything he'd sacrificed. Eduardo was rewriting history, casting his minimal, unreliable assistance as enormous sacrifices that entitled him to whatever financial support he demanded. Eduardo, what exactly have you sacrificed to take care of me? I've spent hours every week driving you to dialysis. I've rearranged my schedule, missed opportunities, put your needs before my own. I could have moved to another city for better job prospects, but I stayed here to make sure you had family support. The revisionist history was breathtaking. Eduardo was describing a version of our relationship that bore no resemblance to reality, casting himself as a devoted caregiver who'd put his life on hold for my benefit. He seemed to genuinely believe this version of events, or at least he was committed to selling it as truth. Eduardo, you've been consistently late or absent for my medical appointments. You've treated driving me to dialysis like an inconvenience. That interfered with your more important priorities. You abandoned me at a medical facility for 3 hours because something else was more important to you. That was one time, and I apologized. It was the final time in a long pattern of putting your convenience before my needs. Eduardo was quiet for a moment, processing the fact that I wasn't backing down from my assessment of his behavior. He seemed to be recalculating his approach, trying to figure out how to get what he wanted when guilt and manipulation weren't working. Look, Mommy, maybe I haven't been perfect. Maybe I've made some mistakes. But this job opportunity is my chance to change all that. If you help me now, I'll be able to take better care of you. I'll be able to drive you to dialysis again, help with expenses, be the son you deserve. The promise was exactly what I would have wanted to hear 6 months ago. Eduardo was offering to return to providing transportation, to be more reliable, to prioritize my needs. But now I could see the offer for what it was. A transaction. Eduardo would provide better care if I provided financial investment in his latest scheme. His love and support were conditional on my willingness to fund his dreams. "I'm not going to give you $5,000, Eduardo." "Why not? You have the money. I know you have savings, investments, this house. $5,000 is nothing to you, but it's everything to me." "It's not about the money, Eduardo. It's about what this request tells me about how you see our relationship." "What do you mean?" "You've been more attentive over the past few weeks, calling more often, offering to spend time together, being nicer to me than you have in months. But it was all leading up to this request. You were managing my emotions, building up goodwill, so I'd be more likely to give you money when you asked." Eduardo's expression shifted again, and for a moment I saw something that might have been shame. But it passed quickly, replaced by defensiveness and anger. "That's not true. I've been trying to repair our relationship because I love you. You've been trying to manage our relationship because you need money. There's a difference. You know what, Mommy? Maybe you're right. Maybe I have been thinking about this request. But so what? I'm your son. I'm the person who's going to take care of you as you get older. Investing in my success is investing in your own future security." "Eduardo, you haven't taken care of me. I've taken care of you. I pay half your rent. I provide meals and emotional support. I've funded your various career attempts and education goals. You provide minimal, unreliable transportation assistance and present it like you're making enormous sacrifices. I'm all you have, Mommy. Without me, you'd be completely alone." The words hit their intended target, triggering the fear that had kept me accepting Eduardo's poor treatment for years. The fear of abandonment, of isolation, of having no family support as I aged and became more vulnerable. Eduardo was threatening to remove even his inadequate presence from my life if I didn't fund his latest opportunity. But instead of the panic this threat would have caused 6 months ago, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Relief that Eduardo had finally said out loud what his behavior had been communicating for years. He saw our relationship as transactional, his presence in my life as a favor he provided in exchange for financial support. He'd finally admitted that his love and care were conditional on my willingness to pay for them. "Eduardo, if giving you money is the price of having you in my life, then maybe I can't afford you anymore." The words surprised us both. I'd never spoken to Eduardo with such directness, such finality. I'd never suggested that our relationship might not be worth the cost it demanded. Eduardo stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been panic. "You don't mean that." "I mean exactly that. I won't be manipulated or guilted into funding opportunities that sound like scams. I won't be threatened with abandonment for refusing to give you money. And I won't pretend that what we have is a healthy relationship when it's actually financial exploitation dressed up as family obligation." "Fine. If that's how you feel, if that's how little you think of me, then maybe we do need some space from each other." Eduardo grabbed his keys from my coffee table and headed toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back with an expression of cold calculation that I'd never seen before. "I hope you know what you're doing, Mommy. I hope you're not going to regret this decision when you're sitting alone in some nursing home with no family to visit you." And then he was gone, leaving me in the silence of my living room with the echo of his threat hanging in the air. But instead of the devastation I might have expected, I felt something surprising. Peace. For the first time in years, I'd set a clear boundary with Eduardo and held it even when he'd tried to manipulate me into backing down. I'd refused to be extorted for his affection, refused to pay for the privilege of being treated poorly by my own son. That night, I called Stephen Morrison. "I want to make sure my will is ironclad," I said. "I want to ensure that Eduardo can't successfully challenge it, no matter what arguments he makes." "We can add some additional protections," Stephen said. "Document your mental competency. Include more detailed explanations of your reasoning. Perhaps have a psychological evaluation done to preempt any claims of diminished capacity. Whatever it takes, I want Isabel to inherit what I'm leaving her without having to fight Eduardo for it. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet house and thought about the conversation with Eduardo. His final threat about nursing homes and family visits had been revealing. In Eduardo's mind, the primary value he provided was his presence in my life, the basic human connection that family members should provide freely. He'd reduced his own worth to simply showing up occasionally, and he expected to be paid handsomely for that minimal effort. But over the past few months, I'd learned that genuine care and respect could come from unexpected sources. Carmen and the other transport drivers treated me with more consideration than Eduardo did. Nancy and the dialysis staff showed more concern for my well-being. Isabel and her family provided more joy and meaningful connection. Patricia offered more emotional support and practical wisdom. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't dependent on Eduardo for human connection or care. That realization was liberating in ways I was still learning to understand. For the first time in years, I could make decisions based on what was right, rather than what would keep Eduardo happy enough to remain in my life. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in months. I made my coffee, took my medications, and prepared for another Tuesday dialysis appointment with medical transport. As I waited for Carmen to arrive, I looked around my house and thought about Isabel's children playing in the backyard, their laughter filling spaces that had been quiet for too long. Eduardo had been wrong about one thing. This house wouldn't be empty when I was gone. It would be full of a young family's dreams and futures and possibilities. Isabel's children would grow up in these rooms, play in this yard, create memories that would last for generations. My life's work would continue through their lives, creating ripples of positive impact that Eduardo never could have achieved. That felt like exactly the kind of legacy I wanted to leave behind. 6 months had passed since Eduardo's angry departure from my house, 6 months since his threat about nursing homes and family visits. The silence between us had stretched longer than any previous disagreement, but instead of the loneliness I'd feared, I'd discovered something unexpected: contentment. My life had simplified in ways I hadn't anticipated, and the constant stress of managing Eduardo's moods and needs had lifted like a weight I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. The medical transport service had become as routine as breathing. Carmen picked me up every Tuesday and Saturday, while Robert handled Thursdays. They knew my schedule, my preferences, my medical needs. Carmen always brought an extra sweater because she remembered I got cold during treatments. Robert always arrived 5 minutes early because he knew I worried about being late. Their reliability had become something I could count on absolutely, which was a luxury I'd never experienced with Eduardo. My relationship with Isabel and her family had deepened naturally over the months. She stopped by twice a week now, sometimes with the children, sometimes alone when they were at school or daycare. We'd developed an easy friendship that felt genuine and unforced. She helped me with small household tasks that had become difficult as my energy declined, and I provided a listening ear when she needed to talk through the challenges of juggling work, marriage, and motherhood. Isabel never asked about Eduardo, though I suspected her mother had filled her in on some of the details. She was too polite and too kind to pry into family conflicts that didn't involve her directly. But I could see her noticing things: my improved mood, my reduced anxiety around treatment days, my willingness to make plans and commitments without constantly checking with someone else first. Dr. Martinez had noticed changes too. During our monthly consultations, he'd commented on my improved emotional state, my better compliance with medication schedules, my more positive outlook about treatment and long-term health management. Stress reduction can have significant impacts on dialysis patients, he'd told me. Whatever changes you've made in your life seem to be working well for your overall health. I hadn't told him about the situation with Eduardo. but I suspected he'd seen enough family dynamics over the years to understand that sometimes the most stressful relationships are the ones we feel most obligated to maintain. It was October, when my health took an unexpected turn. I'd been feeling more tired than usual after treatments, experiencing some dizziness and shortness of breath that hadn't been typical for me. Initially, I attributed it to the changing seasons, the shorter days, the natural fluctuations that came with managing kidney disease. But when the symptoms persisted and worsened, Dr. Martinez ordered additional tests. The results weren't what any of us had hoped for. My kidney function had declined significantly over the past few months, and there were signs of cardiovascular stress that suggested my body was struggling more than usual with the demands of dialysis. Dr. Martinez was careful not to be alarmist, but his message was clear. We needed to have serious conversations about long-term care planning and end-of-life preferences. "How long are we talking about?" I asked, sitting in his office on a Thursday afternoon in late October. "It's difficult to predict exactly. Could be months, could be a year or more. A lot depends on how well your body responds to some adjustments we can make to your treatment protocol. But Maria, I think it's important that you start having conversations with your family about what you want your care to look like going forward." Family. Dr. Martinez didn't know about the estrangement with Eduardo, didn't understand that my family situation had become complicated in ways that couldn't be easily explained. He was operating under the assumption that I had loving relatives who would rally around me during this difficult time, people who would help me navigate the medical and emotional challenges ahead. "I'll think about what you've said," I told him. That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and really processed what Dr. Martinez had told me. My time was limited, more limited than I'd expected. The life I'd been rebuilding over the past 6 months, the peace I'd found in Eduardo's absence, the contentment of my simple routine, all of it was temporary in ways I was still learning to understand. But instead of panic or despair, I felt a strange sense of completion. I'd made the hard decision to change my will, to set boundaries with Eduardo, to stop enabling his destructive behavior. I'd created a legacy that would benefit someone who deserved it, someone who would use my life's work to build something positive and meaningful. If my time was running short, at least I'd used it well. The next morning, Isabel arrived for one of her regular visits, bringing her daughter Sophia, who was home from school with a minor cold. Sophia was 4 years old, bright and curious, and full of the kind of energy that made my quiet house feel alive. She always asked to see my photo albums, fascinated by the pictures of my late husband and stories about life in our neighborhood decades earlier. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you look tired today," Isabel said, settling Sophia at my kitchen table with some crayons and paper. "Are you feeling all right?" I'd been debating whether to tell Isabel about my recent medical news, unsure how much to share about health problems that would inevitably affect our friendship. But looking at her concerned face, her genuine care for my well-being, I realized that she deserved to know what was happening. "I had some test results yesterday that weren't great," I said. "My kidney function has declined, and Dr. Martinez thinks we need to start planning for the possibility that my time might be limited." Isabel's expression shifted immediately, sadness and concern replacing the casual warmth of our usual interactions. "Oh, Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm so sorry. What does that mean exactly? What kind of timeline are we talking about?" "Maybe months, maybe longer. It's hard to predict. But I wanted you to know because our friendship has become important to me, and I didn't want you to be caught off guard if things change quickly." Sophia looked up from her coloring, picking up on the serious tone of our conversation, even if she couldn't understand the specifics. Isabel reached over and smoothed her daughter's hair, then looked back at me with an expression of determination I hadn't seen before. "What can we do to help? What do you need?" The question was so immediate, so automatic, that it took me by surprise. Isabel didn't hesitate or calculate or consider how my health problems might inconvenience her family. She simply asked what I needed and waited to hear how she could provide it. I don't need anything right now. The medical transport is working well, my treatments are stable, my daily routine is manageable. I just wanted you to know what's happening. Mrs. Rodriguez, you've been like a grandmother to Sophia and Miguel. You're family to us. Please don't hesitate to ask for anything at all. Family. Isabel used the word so naturally, without the complications and conditions that had defined my relationship with Eduardo. She considered me family not because of genetics or obligation, but because of the genuine affection and mutual support we'd developed over time. That afternoon, after Isabel and Sophia left, I called Stephen Morrison to discuss updating some final details of my estate planning. I wanted to make sure all my medical directives were current, that my will was as legally secure as possible, and that Isabel would be able to access the inheritance without unnecessary delays or complications. Given your health situation, we should also consider setting up some immediate support for you, Stephen suggested. Power of attorney arrangements, someone who can help make medical decisions if you become unable to advocate for yourself. The conversation reminded me that there were practical aspects of aging and declining health that I hadn't fully considered. Someone would need to be authorized to make decisions on my behalf, to manage my finances and medical care if I became incapacitated. Traditionally, that responsibility would fall to Eduardo as my only child and closest relative. Stephen, I don't want Eduardo to have any legal authority over my care or finances. Is there a way to prevent that? Absolutely. We can set up power of attorney documents that designate someone else entirely. Do you have someone in mind? I thought about Isabel, about her demonstrated reliability and good judgment. But asking her to take on legal and financial responsibility for an elderly neighbor felt like too much. Too heavy a burden for someone with young children and her own life to manage. What about a professional arrangement? Someone who specializes in elder care management? Stephen recommended a service that provided professional advocates for elderly clients without family support. They could handle medical decision-making, financial management, and end-of-life care coordination. It would cost money, but it would ensure that my preferences were respected and that Eduardo couldn't override my wishes even if he reappeared during a health crisis. That sounds perfect, I said. I want Eduardo to have no legal standing to make decisions about my care or my estate. Over the next few weeks, we finalized all the legal arrangements. Professional advocates would handle my medical and financial decisions if I became incapacitated. Isabel would inherit my entire estate, including detailed instructions about my wishes for the house and personal belongings. Eduardo would receive nothing except a brief letter explaining my decision and a small box of family photos that belonged to his father's side of the family. As we completed the paperwork, Stephen asked a question that had been weighing on my mind. Maria, have you considered whether you want to tell Eduardo about your health situation? Regardless of your conflicts, he might want to know that you're facing these challenges. I'd been debating this question for weeks. Did Eduardo have a right to know that his mother was dying? Did basic human decency require me to give him an opportunity to reconcile, to make amends, to be present during my final months? I don't think so, I said finally. Eduardo made it clear that his presence in my life was conditional on my financial support. He threatened to abandon me if I didn't meet his demands. I'm just taking him at his word. But people sometimes say things in anger that they don't really mean. Stephen, Eduardo didn't just say hurtful things in anger. He demonstrated through months of behavior that my needs and feelings weren't important to him. The angry words were just the honest expression of attitudes he'd been showing me for years. Still, the question haunted me over the following days. Was I being vindictive by not telling Eduardo about my health situation? Was I denying him a chance to redeem himself, to step up and be the son I'd always hoped he could be? But every time I considered reaching out to him, I remembered the cold calculation in his expression during our last conversation. The way he'd tried to manipulate me into funding his questionable business opportunity. The casual cruelty of his threat about nursing homes and family visits. Eduardo had shown me exactly who he was when he thought I might not comply with his demands. November brought the first significant snow of the season, and with it, an unexpected challenge. The medical transport service had protocols for severe weather, but they couldn't guarantee pickup times when road conditions were dangerous. On the Tuesday after the first blizzard, Carmen called to explain that my transport would be delayed by several hours due to emergency road closures. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Rodriguez. We'll get you to dialysis today, but it might not be until this afternoon instead of this morning." The delay wasn't anyone's fault, and Carmen's apologetic professionalism reminded me why the transport service had been such a good decision. They communicated clearly, took responsibility for problems beyond their control, and worked to find solutions rather than making excuses. But as I hung up the phone, I had a moment of vulnerability that surprised me. For just a few seconds, I wondered if Eduardo would have been more reliable in a situation like this. Would he have braved the snow to get me to my treatment on time? Would he have found a way to navigate the road closures that professional drivers couldn't handle? The thought was fleeting and probably unrealistic. Eduardo's track record with reliability in good weather hadn't been impressive. There was no reason to believe he would have performed better during a snowstorm. But the moment of doubt reminded me that my decision to cut ties with him had consequences I was still discovering. That afternoon, when Carmen finally arrived, to take me to dialysis, she was full of apologies and explanations about the delayed schedule. She'd been working since early morning, helping transport other patients whose appointments had been disrupted by the storm. Her dedication to ensuring everyone received their necessary medical care was remarkable, and it reminded me that some people took their responsibilities seriously, regardless of circumstances. "I hope this delay doesn't mess up your whole day," she said, as we carefully navigated the icy roads. "Not at all. These things happen. I appreciate you making sure I got there safely. That's what we're here for. Reliable transportation, whatever the weather brings. Reliable transportation, whatever the weather brings." It occurred to me that this was exactly what I'd hoped for from Eduardo, what I'd needed but never received. Basic reliability, professional competence, follow-through regardless of circumstances. Carmen, who was paid to provide a service, understood these expectations better than my own son had. December arrived with news that I'd been expecting but wasn't fully prepared for. Dr. Martinez called to say that my latest test results showed continued decline, and he wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss transitioning to comfort care rather than aggressive treatment. My kidneys were failing more rapidly than anticipated, and my body wasn't responding well to the increased demands of more frequent dialysis. "How much time?" I asked. "Probably weeks rather than months. I'm sorry, Maria. I know this isn't what we were hoping for. Weeks rather than months." The timeline had accelerated beyond what any of us had expected. I would need to make final arrangements quickly, ensure that Isabel understood what was coming, prepare for an end that was approaching faster than I'd planned. That evening, Isabel arrived for one of her regular visits, bringing both children, and a container of soup she'd made. Miguel, her 6-year-old son, immediately headed for my bookshelf where I kept a collection of children's stories, while Sophia settled at my kitchen table with her ever-present art supplies. "Isabel, I need to tell you something important," I said, waiting until the children were occupied with their activities. "Is it about your health? You've seemed more tired lately." "Yes, Dr. Martinez thinks I only have a few weeks left. My kidneys are failing faster than expected, and my body isn't handling the treatments well anymore." Isabel's face went through a series of emotions: shock, sadness, denial, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance that reminded me she'd probably been preparing for this possibility since our conversation in October. "What can we do? How can we help you through this?" Again, her immediate response was to ask how she could provide support rather than focusing on how my situation would affect her family. Isabel's generosity of spirit was consistent and remarkable. Exactly the kind of character that had convinced me she deserved to inherit my estate. I don't want to be a burden on your family during this time. Mrs. Rodriguez, you could never be a burden. You've been nothing but kind to us. Let us return some of that kindness now. Over the next hour, we talked about practical arrangements. Isabel insisted that I shouldn't spend my final weeks alone, and she offered to coordinate a schedule of visits that would ensure someone was checking on me daily. She wanted to help with grocery shopping, meal preparation, medication management, any tasks that were becoming difficult for me. "What about your son?" she asked gently. "Should we try to contact him?" I'd been dreading this question, but had known it would come eventually. Isabel was too caring, too family-oriented, to understand why I wouldn't want my only child present during my final weeks. Eduardo and I haven't spoken in months. We had a significant disagreement, and he made it clear that he didn't want to maintain our relationship unless I met certain financial demands. But surely, if he knew how serious your condition is— Isabel, I appreciate your generous heart, but Eduardo had many opportunities to show me love and respect. He chose not to take those opportunities. I'm not going to chase after him. Now, hoping he'll suddenly become the son I always wanted him to be, Isabel nodded, though I could see she didn't fully understand my decision. From her perspective, family reconciliation was always worth pursuing, especially when time was running short. But she respected my choice without arguing or trying to convince me otherwise. That night, I lay in bed thinking about Eduardo, wondering where he was and what he was doing. Was he working at the car sales job he'd described, or had that opportunity fallen through like so many others? Was he still living in the apartment I'd been helping to pay for, or had his financial situation forced him to make other arrangements? Did he ever think about me, wonder how I was managing without his sporadic assistance? The questions were painful because they reminded me that despite everything, I still loved him. I still hoped he was well, still worried about his future, still wished our relationship could have been different. But love without respect wasn't sustainable, and hope without evidence was just wishful thinking. Eduardo had shown me clearly what our relationship meant to him, what value he placed on my well-being versus his own convenience. Believing that my approaching death would somehow transform him into a loving, reliable son was probably naive. More likely, he would reappear, hoping to reconcile just long enough to ensure he received an inheritance he felt entitled to. Christmas was approaching, and Isabel asked if I wanted to spend the holiday with her family. The invitation was genuine and heartfelt, but I declined. I wanted to spend what might be my last Christmas quietly, reflecting on my life and the choices I'd made. Isabel respected my decision but insisted on bringing Christmas dinner to my house so I wouldn't be completely alone. "You've become family to us," she said. "Family doesn't spend Christmas alone." On Christmas morning, Isabel arrived with her husband Carlos and the children, carrying containers of food and wrapped presents that I hadn't expected. They'd brought me a photo album filled with pictures from our friendship over the past year. Images of the children playing in my backyard, family gatherings where I'd been included, moments of connection and joy that I'd treasured, but hadn't realized were being documented. "We wanted you to see how much you've meant to our family," Isabel explained as I turned through the pages. "You've been like a grandmother to Sophia and Miguel, like a mother to me when I needed guidance and support." The album was one of the most thoughtful gifts I'd ever received, a tangible reminder that my life had mattered to people who would remember me with love and gratitude. Looking at the pictures, seeing the genuine happiness on everyone's faces, I felt a peace about my legacy that I'd never experienced before. That afternoon, as we sat around my dining room table sharing Christmas dinner, I watched Isabel's family and felt profound gratitude for the unexpected blessing they'd become in my life. Sophia and Miguel called me abuela, grandmother, and treated me with the natural affection of children who'd always known love and security. Carlos spoke to me with respectful warmth, including me in conversations about neighborhood changes and local politics like my opinions mattered. This was what family was supposed to feel like: mutual respect, genuine care, natural inclusion, unconditional support. Not the transaction-based relationship I'd endured with Eduardo, where my value was tied to my willingness to provide financial assistance and emotional validation without receiving much in return. After they left that evening, I called Stephen Morrison to confirm that all my legal arrangements were final and secure. I wanted absolute certainty that Isabel would inherit everything without complications, that Eduardo would have no legal standing to challenge my decisions, that my final wishes would be respected and implemented exactly as I'd specified. Everything is in order, Maria. Your will is ironclad, your medical directives are clear, and your estate planning is designed to minimize any potential challenges. Isabel will inherit everything as you've specified, and Eduardo will receive only the items you've designated for him. And if he tries to contest the will, he'll fail. We've documented your mental competency thoroughly, included detailed explanations of your reasoning, and structured everything to withstand legal challenges. Your decisions will stand. That night, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't expected. I'd managed to arrange my affairs in a way that reflected my values and rewarded the people who'd shown me genuine care. Eduardo's name had been completely removed from my financial legacy, but Isabel's children would grow up with opportunities and security that would shape their entire futures. It was then that my phone rang. Eduardo's name appeared on the caller ID for the first time in 6 months, and for a moment, I simply stared at it, wondering what had prompted him to break our long silence. Was this coincidence? Or had he somehow learned about my declining health? Had someone told him about my situation, prompting this unexpected contact? I let the call go to voicemail, unsure whether I was ready for whatever conversation Eduardo wanted to have. But as I sat in my quiet living room, surrounded by the Christmas gifts from Isabel's family and the peace I'd found in their genuine love, I realized that nothing Eduardo could say would change the fundamental truths about our relationship. He'd shown me who he was through years of behavior. I'd made my decisions based on that evidence. Whatever brought him back now, whether guilt or need or genuine regret, it was too late to undo the damage that had already been done. But I was curious enough about his message to listen to what he had to say. After all, this might be the last communication we'd ever have. I owed it to the history we'd shared, if not to Eduardo himself, to hear whatever words he thought were important enough to break months of silence. I picked up my phone and played the voicemail, preparing myself for whatever version of Eduardo would be speaking to me from across the months of estrangement and hurt that had defined our final separation. Eduardo's voice on the voicemail was different than I remembered, more confident, almost cheerful. "Mommy, it's me. I know it's been a while, but I have some really exciting news to share with you. I got that promotion I was working toward, and things are finally turning around for me. I'd love to come by and tell you all about it. Maybe take you to dinner to celebrate. Call me back when you get this." The message was casual, upbeat, with no acknowledgement of our months-long estrangement, or the harsh words that had ended our last conversation. Eduardo was acting as if he could simply reappear in my life whenever it suited him, as if time and hurt feelings were minor inconveniences that could be brushed aside with news of his latest success. I didn't call him back that night, or the next day. I needed time to process this unexpected contact, to decide whether I had the emotional energy for whatever Eduardo wanted from me. My health was declining rapidly, and every day brought new challenges that required most of my strength and focus. But Eduardo was persistent. He called again the next evening, and when I didn't answer, he left another message. This one was more pressing, less casual. "Mommy, I'm starting to worry about you. It's not like you not to return my calls. I'm going to stop by tomorrow to make sure you're okay." The presumption irritated me. Eduardo had ignored me for 6 months. had walked out of my house with threats and ultimatums, and now he was positioning himself as a concerned son worried about my welfare. He was rewriting history again, casting himself as the caring family member, rather than the person who'd abandoned our relationship when I'd refused to fund his questionable business ventures. True to his word, Eduardo appeared at my door the next afternoon. I watched through my front window as he got out of a car I didn't recognize, a newer model sedan that seemed expensive for someone who'd been asking me for money just months earlier. He was dressed well, carrying himself with confidence that hadn't been there during our last encounter. When I opened the door, Eduardo's expression immediately shifted to concern. "Mommy, you look terrible. Are you sick? Have you been eating properly?" I did look terrible. I knew that. The progression of my kidney disease had accelerated over the past weeks, leaving me gaunt and pale, with the telltale signs of someone whose body was struggling to function. But Eduardo's sudden concern felt performative, like he was playing the role of a devoted son for an audience I couldn't see. "I've been managing," I said, not inviting him inside. "Come on, let me in. We need to talk. I've missed you, and I have so much to tell you about what's been happening in my life." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him enter. Eduardo looked around my living room with an expression I couldn't quite read, taking inventory of my furniture, my belongings, perhaps assessing the value of everything he saw. "Mommy, I owe you an apology for how our last conversation ended. I was stressed about work, worried about money, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair, and I'm sorry." The apology was smooth, practiced, like something he'd rehearsed, but it didn't address the core issues that had driven us apart. His chronic unreliability, his treatment of my time and needs as unimportant, his attempt to extort money from me through emotional manipulation. "What do you want, Eduardo?" "I want to rebuild our relationship. I want to make up for lost time. I know I haven't been the best son, but I'm in a better place now, financially and emotionally. I can take care of you the way I should have been, doing all along." Take care of me. The phrase triggered memories of all the ways Eduardo had failed to provide basic support when I'd actually needed it. The dialysis appointments where he'd been hours late, the promises he'd broken, the casual disregard for my well-being that had characterized our relationship for years. "Eduardo, what's really going on? Why are you here now, after 6 months of silence?" "I told you, I missed you. I realized that family is more important than money or career success. I want us to be close again." But something in his demeanor suggested otherwise. Eduardo kept glancing around my house, asking casual questions about my health, my daily routine, my support systems. It felt like reconnaissance rather than genuine interest in my well-being. "How did you know I was sick?" I asked. Eduardo's expression flickered for just a moment, a tell that suggested he'd revealed more than he'd intended. "You look sick, Mommy. Anyone can see that. Have you been getting proper medical care?" "Who told you about my health situation?" "Nobody told me anything. I can see with my own eyes that you're not well. That's why I'm here, to help you through whatever you're dealing with." But I didn't believe him. Eduardo's sudden reappearance, his confident demeanor, his expensive car, his claim of professional success, all of it felt too convenient to be coincidental. Someone had told him about my declining health, and he'd calculated that this was the right time to re-establish contact. Over the next hour, Eduardo shared details about his supposed career advancement, his financial improvement, his newfound maturity and responsibility. But the stories didn't quite add up. The timeline was vague, the specifics were contradictory, and his explanations raised more questions than they answered. "I'm actually doing so well now that I can help you with expenses," he said. "Medical bills, household costs, whatever you need. I know things have been tight for you since you started using that transport service instead of letting me drive you to dialysis." The offer revealed his real motivation. Eduardo thought I was struggling financially, probably assumed that my medical expenses had depleted my savings. He was positioning himself as my financial savior, creating a scenario where I would be grateful for his support and presumably inclined to restore his inheritance. I'm managing my expenses fine, Eduardo. But medical transport is expensive, and your insurance probably doesn't cover everything. Let me help. It's the least I can do after being absent for so long. Why do you think I need financial help? Eduardo seemed genuinely surprised by the question. Well, you're elderly. You have serious health problems. You're living on a fixed income. Most people in your situation struggle with medical expenses. Most people in your situation. Eduardo was making assumptions about my financial status based on stereotypes about elderly dialysis patients. He didn't actually know anything about my savings, my investments, or my insurance coverage. He was operating on guesswork and wishful thinking. Eduardo, I need to rest. This conversation is tiring me out. Of course. But before I go, I want you to know that I'm here for you now. Whatever you need, whenever you need it. I can drive you to dialysis again, help with shopping, handle any paperwork or medical decisions that are getting overwhelming. Medical decisions. Eduardo was positioning himself to resume decision-making authority in my life, probably hoping to regain influence over my care and finances. But I'd already made legal arrangements that excluded him entirely from those responsibilities. I have everything handled, but thank you for the offer. Mommy, don't be so independent. Let your son take care of you. That's what family is for. After Eduardo left, promising to check on me again soon, I sat in my living room trying to process the conversation. Something about his visit felt orchestrated, calculated. His concern seemed genuine on the surface, but underneath I sensed the same manipulative energy that had characterized our final argument months earlier. That evening, I called Patricia to share my suspicions about Eduardo's sudden reappearance. He just showed up out of nowhere, acting like the concerned son? She asked. And he keeps asking questions about my finances, my medical care, my daily support systems. It feels like he's gathering information rather than offering genuine help. Maria, somebody told him about your health situation. That's the only explanation for his timing. But who would have done that? I'd been wondering. The same thing. Very few people knew about my prognosis, and most of them were medical professionals bound by confidentiality requirements. Isabel and her family knew, but they would never violate my privacy by contacting Eduardo without permission. The answer came 2 days later when Nancy from the dialysis center called with an unusual request. Mrs. Rodriguez, I need to inform you about a privacy incident. A man claiming to be your son called the center yesterday asking about your treatment schedule and health status. Of course, we couldn't give him any information without your permission, but I wanted you to know that someone was inquiring. What did he say exactly? He said he'd been out of touch with you for a while due to work travel, and he was trying to reconnect. He wanted to know if you were still receiving treatment here, what your current condition was, whether you had reliable transportation. Our policy is to not confirm or deny anything about patients without written authorization. Did he give you his name? Eduardo Rodriguez. He said he was your son and provided some personal details that seemed accurate, but we still couldn't release any information. So Eduardo had been fishing for information through official channels, trying to confirm details about my health and treatment status. His casual questions during our recent conversation made more sense now. He'd been testing what I would voluntarily share against what he'd been unable to learn through other sources. But if the dialysis center hadn't given him information, how had he learned about my declining health? Someone else had to be his source, someone with access to details about my prognosis and timeline. The mystery was solved when Carmen mentioned something during my next transport to dialysis. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I hope it's okay that I mentioned you to my cousin. She works at Valley General Hospital, and when I told her about some of my regular patients, she recognized your name from some medical records she'd processed." Valley General was where Dr. Martinez had ordered my recent tests, where the results had been analyzed that revealed my accelerated decline. Carmen's cousin had access to medical records and had apparently shared information about my condition with family members. "What exactly did she tell you?" I asked. "Just that your test results had been concerning, that you were probably facing some difficult decisions about your care. I hope I didn't overstep by discussing your situation with family." Carmen hadn't overstepped, but her innocent conversation with her cousin had created a chain of information that somehow reached Eduardo. Medical records weren't supposed to be discussed casually, but human nature made absolute confidentiality difficult to maintain. The important question now was what Eduardo planned to do with the information he'd gathered. His visit had been exploratory, testing my willingness to reconcile and my current support systems. But I suspected he would be back with more specific demands or requests once he'd processed what he'd learned. I didn't have to wait long to find out. Eduardo called that weekend with a proposal that revealed his true motivation for re-establishing contact. "Mommy, I've been thinking about your situation, and I have an idea that could help both of us. What if I moved back in with you for a while? I could provide daily support, help with medical appointments, handle household tasks that are getting difficult for you. Move back in." Eduardo wanted to re-establish himself as my primary caregiver and household companion, positioning himself as indispensable during my final weeks or months. The arrangement would give him access to my daily routine, my financial information, my medical decisions, and probably my will and estate planning documents. "I don't need live-in help, Eduardo. But think about it practically. You're getting sicker, you're living alone, you're depending on strangers for transportation and support. Wouldn't it be better to have family taking care of you? The arrangements I have are working fine. But what happens when they're not enough anymore? What happens when you need help in the middle of the night, or when you have a medical emergency? I could be there for all of that." Eduardo was creating scenarios designed to trigger my fears about aging alone, about becoming helpless, about dying without family present. He was offering to solve problems that didn't currently exist in exchange for access to my life and probably my estate. "I'll consider your offer," I said, wanting to end the conversation without committing to anything. "Don't wait too long to decide, Mommy. Your health isn't going to improve, and these support systems you're relying on might not be reliable when things get really difficult." After we hung up, I realized that Eduardo's strategy was becoming clear. He planned to re-establish himself as my caregiver, demonstrate his devotion during my final months, and position himself as the natural inheritor of my estate. He probably assumed that my anger about our previous conflicts would fade as my health declined, that my need for family support would override my concerns about his past behavior. But Eduardo had miscalculated. I'd already made my decision about him and my estate. His sudden return to my life, motivated by knowledge of my approaching death, only confirmed that I'd been right to remove him from my will. He wasn't offering genuine care or support. He was making a calculated investment in his expected inheritance. That night, I called Stephen Morrison one final time. "I want to add a codicil to my will," I said. "Something that addresses Eduardo's recent contact and makes my reasoning even more explicit." "What kind of codicil?" "I want to document his 6-month absence, his sudden reappearance after learning about my health situation, and his transparent attempt to position himself for inheritance benefits. I want any court that reviews this will to understand exactly what kind of person Eduardo is." Stephen drafted the codicil over the next few days, creating a legal record of Eduardo's behavior that would make any challenge to my will virtually impossible. The document detailed his abandonment of our relationship, his threats and ultimatums, his suspicious return after learning about my health crisis, and his obvious financial motivations. This should eliminate any possibility that Eduardo could successfully contest your will, Stephen assured me. You've documented his character and motivations so thoroughly that no court would side with him over your clearly stated wishes. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in early January, I didn't wake up. Carmen found me when she arrived for my regularly scheduled transport to dialysis. I'd died peacefully in my sleep, exactly the kind of quiet, dignified end I'd hoped. 4. Eduardo received the call about my death from the hospital, since he was listed as my emergency contact despite our estrangement. He arrived at my house within hours, probably expecting to find grief-stricken neighbors who would welcome his support and assistance during the difficult time ahead. Instead, he found Isabel and her family cleaning out my personal belongings, according to detailed instructions I'd left about how my possessions should be distributed. Isabel greeted him politely but coolly, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamics she didn't fully understand. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said. "Your mother was a wonderful woman who meant a great deal to our family." "Thank you. I appreciate everything you've done for her, but I can handle things from here. I'm her son, so I'll be taking care of all the arrangements." Actually, Mrs. Rodriguez left very specific instructions about her final arrangements. Everything has been handled according to her wishes. Eduardo looked confused, probably expecting to find chaos and grief that he could step in to manage. Instead, he found organized efficiency that didn't require his input or assistance. "What do you mean everything has been handled?" "The funeral arrangements, the estate management, the distribution of personal items. Your mother was very thorough in her planning." That afternoon, Eduardo received a call from Stephen Morrison requesting his presence at the reading of my will. Eduardo probably expected this moment, had probably been planning for it during his recent attempts to reconcile with me. He arrived at Stephen's office confident that he would inherit my house, my savings, my investments, everything I'd accumulated over a lifetime of work and saving. Stephen read the will aloud in a conference room that included Eduardo, Isabel, and her family, Patricia, and the professional advocates I'd designated to handle my final affairs. Eduardo listened with growing shock as Stephen explained that my entire estate would go to Isabel, that Eduardo would receive only my wedding ring from his father and a box of family photographs. "This can't be right," Eduardo said when Stephen finished reading. "She's my mother. I'm her only child. There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake, Eduardo. Your mother was very clear about her intentions, and she documented her reasoning thoroughly." Stephen handed Eduardo a sealed envelope containing the letter I'd written explaining my decision. Eduardo read it in silence, his expression shifting from shock to anger to something that looked like panic. The letter detailed his abandonment of me at the dialysis center, his pattern of unreliability and disrespect, his threats when I'd refused to fund his questionable business ventures, and his transparent attempt to reconcile only after learning about my terminal diagnosis. I'd explained that removing him from my will wasn't punishment, but recognition that he'd never demonstrated the character or reliability required to handle a significant inheritance responsibly. "I'm going to contest this," Eduardo said, crumpling the letter in his fist. "This will was made under duress, or she wasn't mentally competent, or someone influenced her improperly. No mother would disinherit her only child without being manipulated." Stephen calmly explained the legal protections we'd built into my estate planning, the mental competency evaluations, the detailed documentation of my reasoning, the witness statements, the codicil addressing Eduardo's recent behavior. Eduardo's chances of successfully contesting the will were essentially zero. "Besides," Stephen added, "your mother included provisions that anyone who challenges the will forfeits even the small bequests designated for them. If you contest this document, you'll receive nothing at all." Eduardo left Stephen's office in a rage, threatening legal action and making accusations about undue influence and family manipulation. But his threats were empty. The will was legally unassailable, and his own behavior had been documented so thoroughly that any court would see his motivations clearly. 6 months later, Eduardo was arrested for running an elaborate investment scam that had defrauded dozens of elderly victims out of their life savings. The luxury car sales job had been a cover for his real work, targeting elderly people with fake investment opportunities, high-pressure sales tactics, and promises of guaranteed returns. The day I'd been abandoned at the dialysis center, Eduardo hadn't been at a job interview. He'd been at the Riverside Casino, gambling away money he'd stolen from his elderly victims, celebrating what he thought would be his biggest score yet. The 3 hours I'd spent waiting for him had been 3 hours he'd spent at slot machines and poker tables, literally gambling while his mother sat alone in a medical facility. The security footage from the casino that day showed Eduardo laughing, drinking, winning, and losing thousands of dollars while I waited for him to remember that he had a responsibility to pick me up. The footage was used as evidence in his criminal trial, demonstrating his callous disregard for even basic human decency. Isabel used the inheritance to buy a larger house with a good school district for her children, to establish college funds for Sofia and Miguel, and to start a nonprofit organization providing transportation assistance for elderly dialysis patients. The money I'd worked a lifetime to accumulate was creating opportunities and solving problems that would benefit people for generations. Eduardo received a 7-year prison sentence for elder abuse and fraud. He'd targeted people like me, elderly individuals with limited family support and significant assets, convincing them to invest their savings in fake opportunities that existed only to enrich him. The cruel irony was that he'd had access to a legitimate inheritance worth more than he'd stolen from all his victims combined. But his greed and sense of entitlement had cost him everything. From my perspective, watching all of this unfold from whatever place we go when our earthly lives end, I felt vindicated in my decision. Eduardo had shown me exactly who he was through his actions, and I'd believed him. The inheritance I'd left to Isabel was creating exactly the kind of positive impact I'd hoped for, while Eduardo faced the consequences of choices that revealed his true character. Sometimes the people who claim to love us are the ones who hurt us most. Sometimes family members are the least trustworthy people in our lives. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is protect our legacy from those who would waste it, ensuring that our life's work benefits people who will honor it rather than squander it. I'd dialyzed Eduardo's name right out of my will, and, in doing so, I'd finally set the boundary that should have been set years earlier. Love without respect isn't love at all. It's manipulation, exploitation, and emotional abuse disguised as family obligation. The most loving thing I ever did for Eduardo was to stop enabling his destructive behavior, even if he was too selfish to understand that lesson. My story isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about recognizing that we teach people how to treat us, and sometimes the most important lesson we can teach is that poor treatment has consequences. Even when that lesson comes too late for the teacher, it might not be too late for everyone else who hears the story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.